Okay, so you might have seen this story recently, but there's going to be a new CBC president soon, and we thought this would be a good time to look at the future of the public broadcaster. Earlier this week, we heard from our critics, some of whom want to defund the CBC. Today, the other side, the case for the CBC. I'm Alamin Abdul-Mahmoud, and this is Commotion. This week, we are talking about the future of the CBC. As you probably know, calls to defund the public broadcaster are getting louder and louder. Plus, a new mandate for the CBC is in the works, and a new president and CEO is about to take over. So we kind of thought that right now, this might be the right time to tackle this head on. So on Wednesday, I invited Rupa Subramanya and Sabrina Maddow and Harrison Lohman to come on and speak their minds.
A CBC TV is a no-brainer. It should be privatized. If you have a good product, you have subscribers and supporters. It's as simple as that. People will want to pay for it. We've forgotten that basic lesson in Canada where the government is always ready to write a check for you and bail you out when you're failing. And unfortunately, I see the CBC in that category.
Right now, it seems like Canadians aren't watching it. I think the numbers play that out, and they're not finding the value in it. So we talk about a show that's maybe meant to elevate Canadian artists or musicians. How many of those are actually ending up being elevated? Like, is the content working and achieving its goals? I don't think we're seeing any real evidence of that. And there's been a reluctance by the CBC to really ask itself those tough questions. And that's where I think a lot of the frustration comes in for Canadians.
I am here to warn the CBC. It is on borrowed time. I have it on good authority. It is within Pierre Poilievre's, first 100-day plan to take a chunk out of the CBC.
I gotta say, it was not an easy time sitting there and hearing them make the case for defunding or deeply cutting the public broadcaster. But also, here's the thing. This is such an important conversation because, as I said before, whether you love the CBC or you hate it, or maybe you're completely indifferent, it still is the largest publicly funded cultural institution in this country. So all of us have a stake in it. So today we are here for a different take. Nanaba Duncan is a former CBC radio host and current Cardi Chair in Journalism, Diversity and Inclusion Studies at Carleton's Journalism School in Ottawa. Max Fawcett is a lead columnist for the National Observer. He's in Calgary. And Jonathan Torrens is an actor, author, and podcaster. He's in Truro, Nova Scotia. And they're all here to make the case that the CBC is vitally important and should be publicly funded. Hello to all of you.
Hello.
Thanks for having us.
Yes.
I'm delighted that you guys are all here. I'm really grateful that you're all here. Max, I'm going to start with you. Why do you believe the CBC should continue to receive public funding?
I grew up with the CBC, always being on in the background of all the rooms that I was in. It was in the kitchen. It was sort of the base to my childhood, and I think that's true of a lot of people from its inception in the 1930s to its glory days in the 70s and the 80s. The CBC has always been an instrument of national unity. It connects Canadians from coast to coast in our vast country. It serves as connective tissue in a place where we might otherwise have fallen more fully into the orbit of the United States. And I think we need that now more than ever. With the rise of the internet, the subsequent decline of traditional journalism, it feels like we all live in our own little bubbles these days. We're strangers to each other, even as we share the same country, the same city, even the same street. And as the quality of the information we consume gets more degraded by partisanship, social media, Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it, as well as the bad faith actors who want to sow chaos in democracies like ours, we really need some common ground where we can gather together to discuss the things that matter to us as a country. And I still believe that the CBC can and should be that place.
I was going to say, how do you counter the claim that the market, I think this is what Rupa was sort of saying, is like, it's not that is not needed. It's not like the market should be the place to do that and not a publicly funded broadcaster. Yeah,
I think that's how do I put this politely? It's a bit delusional. It does not recognize the reality of Canada, and especially of English Canada. I think French Canada is a little different because of the linguistic differences. They have a market that is contained and can sort of serve a product. But English Canada, we're the only country in the world that is next to a country that is 10 times larger than us, that has an entertainment industry 10 times, 100 times larger than ours. And we have to compete with that as cultural entrepreneurs. Nowhere else on earth, not in France, not in Germany, not in Japan, nowhere. So, English Canada is probably the hardest media market, whether you're an artist or you're a journalist on earth, and to just sort of throw things to the market is basically to surrender. And surrender to being a colony of the United States. And I don't think anyone, I hope, anyone wants that in this country.
Nanaba, you worked at CBC Radio for more than a decade. You're now leading a new generation of journalists at Carleton's journalism school. To anyone who believes that the CBC should be defunded or a whole bunch of it should be cut, what do you say? Like, in other words, like, what is the value of the CBC?
To someone who would say that, I would say, do you know what CBC does?
Oof, go on.
Are you aware of how it serves people? There are areas in this country where CBC is the resource from which people learn what is happening in their communities. If you're going to get rid of that, then are we to believe that private broadcasters are going to go, oh, we'll do it? And that they're going to take it up and say, we will be beholden to Canadians, all Canadians. We won't just be beholden to our shareholders.
Mm-hmm. I like that. I like that you're like, punctuation, period, end of the sentence. I mean, I'm glad you bring that up, because that's one of the things that came up, Nanaba, in the conversation, is like the CBC broadcasts in 8 Indigenous languages. It's hard to imagine any of the other the commercial broadcasters saying this is a whole,
I ask. Who will do that?
Whomst will do that is a really big question. Jonathan, for anyone who might not know, you got your start as a teenager on a little CBC show called Street Sense. Before I ask what the CBC means to you personally, can I just ask you, what do you think the CBC means for Canada?
Well, I think I bring a different perspective in that I live in rural Nova Scotia. And I see the screens in people's homes as I drive home along the number 2 highway every night. Like, you want to break into a car in Charlottetown, do it during the CBC Supper Hour News when 96% of the island is glued to the news show as their source for everything that's happening there. That's a hot tip.
Thanks for the robbery advice. Okay, continue.
Exactly.
Just in case.
I know I came up at a time when this was the communications railway that connected people from coast to coast. And if you wanted to know what kids in Toronto were wearing or the accent that kids in Saskatchewan had, there was only one way to do it, and that was to gather around the hearth that was CBC. I recognize it's not what it once was. I recognize it's competing, as you say, Elamine, in an increasingly challenging marketplace. I think competing is doing some heavy lifting. I think CBC TV should stop doing that. I think it's when we compare CBC TV hold it to the same metrics that we hold the private broadcasters, that it falls down by public perception. I think shows like Sort of and Curling Bonspiels is exactly what CBC should be doing, holding up a mirror to ourselves and our experience, especially at this moment as we're evolving and growing, and the country is stronger in some ways than ever and more broken in others. I think it's more critical now than it ever has been. But I think it's when we try to do Americanized Canadian versions of formats, that's where it's not working. I always say it's the wrestling match between Main Street, which is its core audience, and Queen Street, the audience that it's courting. Right. And the truth is, I think it has to cater to both.
I'm glad that you brought up Sort of, because I think like it's actually, to me, it's revolutionary that a show like Sort of exists in this country and could really only be made by the CBC or a partnership with CBC between CBC and HBO, because it is a show about a character who's navigating strained relationships with immigrant parents, and navigating being a caregiver and being a bartender, and also doing all of this. It's also a show about a non-binary lead, and it's a show that won a Peabody Award. Like, it is an incredible show, and the fact that it exists is a testament to the quality of the shows that this place makes, that I don't think the private companies, I'm just going to say it, Max, they don't appear to be interested in telling those stories. And I say that because we have a fair bit of evidence. I feel like what is the last private show that you've seen that is sort of so hell-bent on reflecting this country? And I honestly don't know what comes to mind. Jonathan, maybe it's Shoresy? Like, is that the one that comes to mind for you?
Well, the shows that I think when we've made shows that are distinctly Canadian, like Trailer Park Boys, for example, and like Letterkenny, those tend to be the shows that ironically travel the furthest. Schitt's Creek is another example of that. Obviously, that was a more broad comedy. But those are the shows that tend to travel. It's when we try to ape and chase the echo versus creating the boom that's where it lands with a thud.
Max, the other thing that we hear consistently from critics is that the CBC is a biased organization, that we favor certain points of view, particularly those that you would call ideologically progressive or liberal. Max, you live in Alberta, a place that historically and culturally leans towards the right. How do you encounter that criticism, do you think?
I mean, I hear it a lot, whenever I appear on the CBC or talk about the CBC, and I understand it on some level because I think, and I've lived in downtown Toronto for many years in the past, and it does start to feel like the entire world is downtown Toronto, and it takes you getting away from that to see that there are differences as we go across the country. But, CBC in Alberta, for example, I think it does a wonderful job of covering issues like climate change, oil and gas, all the things that are important to people here, not from a biased perspective, from a really attentive and careful perspective. I guess I'm biased, but I think that the CBC bureaus out here are some of the best in the country. And, I think maybe sometimes we lose track of the fact that every CBC region is its own reflection back to the rest of the country.
Yes.
I do these wonderful things called syndication runs. This is going to be very boring, but you get asked by different radio stations across the country to do the same interview on the same subject. And it's so much fun because the questions actually are all different across the country because, whether you're talking to someone in Victoria or in St. John's, they have different perspectives. And that has so much value. I think we lose sight of that when we think of the CBC as a monolith. It isn't. It's a collection of these sort of, almost independent little news organizations that ladder up to a broader.
Max, you're the first person in history to describe a syndication run as fun. That is, and for that I commend you, and I really appreciate you. Now, do you want to talk about that? Because I saw you vigorously nodding as Max was talking. Go in.
So they know what is important to them. They know what questions to ask. They know what stories to do that will serve their communities. It is an example of how the mandate is fulfilled by CBC. CBC tells itself and tells everyone that it is going to represent the many diverse in many different ways, communities that live here. And I believe that it does that. I can't say that it has always done that in the right way. I have seen and been part of examples that were not good, but I know at the heart of what CBC has tried to do and was trying to do when I was there as well is truly to reflect what was going on.
But can I just say, Max, 2 days ago I had the awkward job of defending the CBC to critics of the CBC. Today I have the awkward job of being on the CBC, being like, well, hold on a minute, we're not getting everything right, and that's an awkward job from an entirely different kind of perspective. But Max, if I could just put it to you, one of the things that the critics said is that we don't speak to people who are right of center. We don't speak to religious Canadians enough. We don't speak to rural Canadians enough. What do you make of that criticism? How does that land with you?
I hear it. I understand it. I think on some level it has validity. I think, like I said, if everyone is gathering in one place, they tend to see the world from one perspective. And I think a little bit more diversity of thought is a good thing. I think CBC tries to do that. That's the thing. CBC is accountable. It really is trying, and that's something that you don't see necessarily with other competitors. And I see it here in Alberta all the time. They are trying to bring people on the radio, on television, who have these other perspectives. I think you can go a little too far there, though, right? The CBC should be the place where people can gather to discuss issues that matter to them and where facts are the currency of the realm, right?
Yeah.
And so that doesn't mean that you should have people on who deny climate change, who think that the Freedom Convoy was an unalloyed good. I think you should have people on to discuss the Freedom Convoy, but I don't think it means just sort of mindlessly parroting both sides of a political debate. It means trying to build a space where you can have the smartest debate possible, and that's hard work. But it's work that only the CBC is prepared to do in this country, and only the CBC is equipped to do.
I was surprised to hear your guest the other day refer to CBC as being not serving rural Canada. I think we have to differentiate between radio and TV as well.
Okay.
Sobeys is our neighborhood grocery store here. I have a friend who grew up in Toronto who thought Sobeys was an upscale shishi neighborhood boulangerie because that was her experience. I think radio is very different from TV. I don't think you can tell me that Son of a Critch doesn't ring the nostalgia bell for many rural Canadians. It's a squishy, warm show that speaks to a certain Canadian experience of a time. So I don't think radio can be scrutinized to the same degree that TV is, because I think they do different things. And maybe, truth be told, radio does more of what our public broadcaster should do. But we just need to ask ourselves as Canadians, is the Paralympics, for example, something that we feel as a country we want people to watch? I would argue yes.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I love about TV, just as an idea, is that even though it's typically something we do by ourselves, we also do it in great numbers by ourselves at the same time. And that's what makes us feel like we've been part of something. And that's frankly one of the things that I miss in this fractured universe. Used to be Friday morning. If you hadn't seen Thursday night must-see TV, you were kind of out of the conversation. So I like it as a gathering place.
I really love that idea of the CBC as a gathering place. I think like that is why I work here. That's why I believe in this project. And I should just say, if folks are just joining us, my name is Alamin Abdul Mahmoud, and this is Commotion, and we are talking about the CBC. Earlier this week, we invited some of our fiercest critics to just make the case. Just let them make the case for defunding and dismantling the CBC. So today, a bit of balance. Nanaba Duncan is here. She's a Cardi Chair in Journalism, Diversity, Inclusion Studies at Carleton University's School of Journalism. Max Fawcett is here. He's a columnist for the National Observer. He's based in Calgary. And the man of many hats, podcast host, actor, author, Jonathan Torrens, is here from Truro, Nova Scotia. Jonathan, can I just ask you, like, if I think about your career, you know, from Jonavision to J-Rock on Trailer Park Boys to the way that you show up on your podcast, you know, you really struck me as someone who tries to transcend any divide. I think like there's a generosity and an openness and just like a generous spirit that shows up in the work that you do. When you think about the CBC as it is right now, not to put you on the spot, but like, what do you think we can learn from your approach to how you take on those roles?
Well, I think in order to be reminded of what it can be, we have to remember what it was. When I started there as a 15-year-old, I would arrive in a truck with that logo on the side of the door. And as a nosy person, it opened doors that I never imagined possible. People would tell me things they wouldn't tell their closest friends because it had a sort of pre-approved credibility and sincerity and trust about it. So those are the things I think that we should try to remember as we rebuild. Because is it perfect? No, of course not. But it's also, in fairness, the most challenging moment in media history where the message is the media. Yeah. It's the opposite of what McLuhan said.
It's exactly the opposite of what McLuhan said. I 100% agree with that characterization. Nanaba, can I just say you are such a loud and effective advocate for inclusion, particularly when it comes to cultural and racial diversity, broadening the voices that we end up hearing from, both in journalism in general, but also on the CBC specifically. I don't need to tell you that I'm a big fan of the work that you do. You already know that. But there are people who have, and I think you heard some of those voices earlier this week, right, who would argue that this backfired. It has narrowed the range of ideological or political opinions that you actually hear on the CBC. How do you make the case for inclusion, for that expansion, bumping up against the idea that it leads to another kind of bias maybe in the work?
Well, I get what people are talking about when they're talking about that sort of the narrow slice that they might be hearing. Yeah. But that's what happens when when people try to make changes. Then there's a focus on the things that they missed before. Now, even though people have been calling for the CBC to be defunded before George Floyd was murdered, I want everyone to remember that some of this calling, I think it's louder because of what happened after that. George Floyd was murdered on May 26th. And then after that, many, many people cared about the oppression of Black folks. Many, many people cared about the lives of Black people. And so we had initiatives, we had conversations, and then at places like the CBC, people had to look at each other and go, oh, damn. Yeah. We need to change things, right? Yes. And so they did that.
Change things in terms of like our focus on stories, our focus on how we hire.
How we are doing these stories, how we hire, how we treat the people in the house, how we talk to the people outside of the house, all of that. And so what folks are seeing is, to me, a part of that trend where, because I'm aware that there are individuals and groups within CBC who have tried to make change. They have changed some of their policies. And so what folks are hearing and seeing is some of that change. And I have to tell you something. We all know that that these changes around inclusion and diversity, it's sliding back. Like we've heard it. Mm-hmm. The initiatives are being taken down, and folks' jobs are being gotten rid of. And so the backsliding is happening. Let me tell you, among Black people, we were saying amongst each other, we got about 6 months of this. When people were marching, we knew that it was going to turn back.
When every organization was saying, let's make some changes, it felt, even then it felt kind of temporary.
Yes, we knew that it was temporary. And so I kind of have to say, like, to the folks who think that there's this slim thing, don't worry, it'll go back. And also I can say to you that, the idea that maybe there's too much, or that we shouldn't care about race or sex, or we shouldn't focus on those things, they're not the only ones who think that. People inside CBC also have expressed thoughts like that.
Of course.
But I think we need to remember that we're going through a process right now as a country of changing, of embracing change, of learning how to be more thoughtful about how we represent different points of view. And there are going to be people who don't like that, who get their backs up about that, who find that threatening. And I think it's a hard line for the CBC to walk, because it has to do this work of representing diversity and representing the country that it is serving as a gathering place for, without letting some folks work the refs too hard here and slow the CBC down on that path. Right? There's a sweet spot of, let's talk about these things that are uncomfortable. And there are people who don't want to talk about those. And quite frankly, that doesn't really matter. We have to talk about them. We just have to talk about them in a way that is as inclusive and welcoming as possible.
If I can just push this a little bit further, though, because I'm really interested in this idea, Nanaba, because I think, like, to me, you're making a connection between the ways that the CBC has changed its approach to covering a lot of these issues, particularly when it comes to race, when it comes to sex, when it comes to homophobia, when it comes to when it comes to dealing with a lot of these issues. There is implicitly you're making a connection between the more that the CBC changes to adjust to reflect these conversations, there is an inverse reaction where the calls to defund are going to get louder. Is that what you're saying? Am I getting that right?
The pendulum swing happens. We will care about things, and then we won't care about things, and then we will care about things, and then we won't care about things.
Sure.
And so in this moment, I actually think that what happens when you start to do something you haven't done before, or you're just doing it in a different way, sometimes you're really awkward. Mm-hmm. So you're really awkward about it, but you're trying to do it right. And then some folks might be like, you're talking about this like just a little bit too much. But what you're trying to do is actually correct what hasn't happened before.
It's a corrective. Right? That's right. Yeah.
Right. It's a corrective. But what that means is that you're going to get folks who say, like, hold on, like, I don't want to hear this. And actually, there was a point that Rupa made. And I do agree that diversity means that there are some perspectives that may be getting lost right now. And perhaps there is a place for them. Mm-hmm. I don't know how. My question, the thing that I struggle with in this part of the conversation is how can we make space for those who dissent and for those who don't like to hear these many different perspectives that have to do with race and sex and ableism and religion and all of this.
Yeah.
How do we make space for them without allowing harm to happen? How do we do that? I'm not sure.
Oh, I was hoping you would tell me. I was hoping that you would.
I will get to it by end of day and send you an email.
You're going to crack the code. And then by the time you're going to crack the code and get back to it. Because I
always like to say that I will fix racism by end of day Friday. Just give me some time.
You got it. You didn't say which Friday, and I understand.
Exactly. You got it.
I got it. I totally got it. I take it seriously, Jonathan, that these conversations are happening not just at the CBC, but at every media organization, to different extents. What I'm proud of in terms of the place where I work, right, is that this is the place that is willing to take it seriously and do so publicly. And I've seen a lot of other news organizations try to get into a lot of these conversations about race, these conversations about reconciliation, and do it briefly and I'm going to say cosmetically, and then back out and sort of like return to the shadows and be like, whoa, well, that was our brief moment of that. Let's never like be accountable publicly to this. I am proud of the fact that the CBC sort of airs its mess publicly. Like, I think there is a working progress that you get to see of the CBC, and it is clunky sometimes, and it makes some people mad sometimes. But to me, that is okay, because that is a function of a public broadcaster, is to stumble through these conversations together. Do you see the private entities being willing at all to take on any of this, Jonathan? Or do you think actually that's the function of a public broadcaster?
Well, I feel like that's the function of a public broadcaster to a degree. I think it's the Neapolitan ice cream approach. A third who we were for better or for worse, a third who we are for better or for worse, and a third what we can be. Oh. I think that's a great outlook for something like the CBC. The truth is the privates are a business, and the metrics by which they are measured are viewers, ad dollars, those kinds of things. I don't think we can ask CBC television, for example, to compete in the same pond. I don't think that's fair. Mm-hmm. So we just have to decide what is a success for a public broadcaster. Mm-hmm. Paralympics, like I say, do we want to be the kind of country that elevates and gives a spotlight to people we haven't seen enough on television? That to me feels like a success. Mm-hmm. But you can't also compare ratings to people that have had far more money or acquired a format from somewhere else. I think. But I do know. When we were doing Jonovision, for example, we learned the hard way sometimes. In 22 minutes, we'd say, today's show is about violence. You can't solve
violence in 22 minutes. It's going to be
22 minutes.
It's going to be a little bit tough.
You need 27
minutes. Let's let the worms out of the can. There's no time to put the worms back in. So bye, we'll see you tomorrow. But that is ultimately probably more irresponsible. I remember we did the same thing with racism. It was well-intended, if a little misguided. We learned that the hard way. But obviously, some of these questions for which there is no clear and concise, obvious answer, I feel like it's better to discuss them than not.
But I was going to say, like, to that point, though, Max, like, the thing that Jonathan's saying there is, like, you do need some metrics of success. If CBC is going to sort of engage in curating and hosting and facilitating these conversations, and the metrics of success are not going to be the eyeballs that the private broadcasters get, it's going to be something else. How do you think you measure the success of the CBC engaging in some of these conversations?
It's got to be vibes, right? We measure everything with vibes.
We do. So, I measure everything by vibes. So absolutely, I'm on board. Yes.
I got a bucket right here, actually.
There we go.
One bucket of vibes.
I think also we need to understand, and I'm sort of circling back to my original point, but just the fact that the CBC, and especially in English Canada, is kind of alone in the world in the challenge it faces. Rupa yesterday, I don't mean to pick on her, but she said that, this is just a reflection of our big government approach, and we don't do it like the Americans, and 40% of GDP is from the federal government. That's not true, by the way. I'll just do a little fact check here from the IMF. That's all government. That's provincial, municipal, federal. And in Finland, it's 53%. In France, it's 58%. In Germany, it's 50%. In Sweden, it's 47%. We're actually on the low end of government spending in our economy. The only one that's lower than us is the United States. And that's the problem here, is we're over-indexing to the way the Americans fund their public broadcaster, to the way they treat their public broadcaster, because they have this giant country filled with people that can support private operations. We don't. And so I think people who, like me and everyone in this conversation who believes in a public broadcaster, we need to have our ambitions set a little higher. It's not just defend the status quo. We should double, triple, quadruple the CBC's funding so it can actually do some amazing and ambitious things. And then let's measure that. Let's see what that does.
I say this with the larger context that, like, Jonathan, you've recently chosen a very successful private path recently, right? Like, you found success. Trailer Park Boys, Letterkenny, there's something to be said about the fact that even though the privates have been very successful for you, your podcast is, doing great. You want to talk about why you still believe in the CBC, even though the private path has been so good for you?
Because I look at the world through a Disney filter. And I think I've been accused of that. And I think it's fun to talk about what we could do and what we can do. But the conversation here should be, what should we do? What to us as Canadians is an important endeavor. And I still believe, as naive and Pollyanna as it may sound, in the fundamental idea that we get to use this open airwave to share our stories. And our stories have never been more diverse and more exciting than ever before. The technology, like I used to need a camera operator and a sound person. There was a producer and maybe a production assistant. We needed a Suburban and we drive 3 hours. Yes. People can make content on their phone that is of a high enough quality to tell our stories tonight. Yeah. So I think, some thought is required on how we update our storytelling, but I really believe in the idea of it.
I not only do I love that, but also I'm also a very Pollyannish person, and so Pollyannish people are my people.
You're kidding?
Yeah, you can tell that about me. Is that a thing that is easily
by the way
surmisable?
All I want in the world is the moxie to say with a straight face, "I am here to warn the CBC that your days are numbered."
He did say it. I mean, okay, can I just say, all of your answers of sort of you've talked a little bit about nostalgia, and you've talked a little bit about the successes of CBC, particularly CBC Radio. Now, is there a case where the CBC doing less? Like, is the CBC trying to do too much with too little? Like, is that one of the things that you're hearing?
It's always been doing too much with too little. Okay. Like, I mean, by that, I just mean, I'm going to be real right now.
Yeah.
I can only say maybe to that. I think as a person who worked mostly in radio, my understanding of everything that happens in TV is fairly limited. But I will say that, and it was interesting to hear about the idea that, TV should be sectioned off.
Sold off, yeah.
Whatever it is that we do, we still need to be everywhere, whether it's TV or radio. We still need to serve everywhere. If some parts of us need to go, that is the hugest decision. And I don't know that I would want to be part of that conversation.
Yeah. And then I was like,
Do not vote
me. Wow. Incredible. Max, let me ask you the same question.
$50.
Yeah, I do have an idea. And I don't know how much money it's going to save, but I think the CBC needs to get out of opinion. I make my living on opinion. I can tell you that the market supports opinion because it's cheap, it's easy. Everyone can have an opinion, as we all know. And I think that the CBC has strayed into, whether it's online opinion pieces or even, God love them, the At Issue panel, being a place where people go for opinion. And I think that invites the claims of bias and of being anti-conservative. And I think taking that opinion piece out, letting the private sector do what it's going to do there, and taking whatever resources that frees up and dedicating it to news coverage, to investigative journalism, to filling these news deserts that keep expanding in the non-urban parts of our country. I think that would be a much better use of the resources. It would serve Canadians better, and it would make it harder for the people who have always wanted to defund the CBC to make that argument.
It's my opinion.
I'd like to make one more argument.
Okay.
This is just something that's different. When I was on the television years ago, we would receive mail from people. It might take 10 days to arrive. And by then, it's already done. This, you say good morning and 100 people write in and say, what about the people that are having a bad morning? They're trying to
yes! Oh my gosh, I remember those emails.
Trying to hashtag pivot in real time and not ruffle and not offend. And it's hard to have confidence and swag and a point of view when you're on the defense all the time.
Yes. No, 100%. It is. That's the cost of doing business at this moment in media, I think, because people are much closer to you, and that's okay. I think that every news organization has to figure out how to adjust to that. Nanaba, I'm going to put you in the tough spot here because I'm going to say, look, this is a serious note. If the CBC is defunded, what's on the line for you and your family? How do you think about that?
We wouldn't be able to hear what's actually going on in our neighborhood and in our city. I value these stories so much. In my family, what we would lose out is that kind of information. And also we would lose out on the representation that is reflected to my kids. As a Black biracial family that is gender diverse, we appreciate it when we hear and see ourselves on CBC. Right? And that goes deep when you're young, when you can see yourself and know that you are like other folks, right?
Yeah.
So what we would lose is that it would be really bad it would be really sad.
Thanks for sharing that. Thank you for taking us inside what that would feel like. Max, clearly you're a big believer in the institutions in general. You've thought this a lot. Just go into it. I'm making you the boss, pal. What do you do right now to turn the tide for the CBC?
Oh, goodness. Well, it's a lot of power.
Yeah.
By Friday.
By Friday, right? Of course, always by Friday.
Yeah.
I would do the things around opinion journalism and focusing more resources on news. I would try to make this a more pressing national conversation. I think a lot of people are kind of sleepwalking into this, thinking that the threats to defund the CBC, it's just it's hot air, it's not going to happen. And I do agree with Harrison that Poilievre will do this. The lady is not for turning on this one, and we need to take this seriously, because this is something that if we lose the CBC, we're never going to build it back up. We're never going to have the appetite or the wherewithal to build what we've created through experimentation and error and trial and success. And I think it's very easy for people to tear it down. It's a lot harder to build it back up. And I was thinking about the question that you asked Anaba about, what would it mean to you for the CBC to disappear? For me, it would mean that my son doesn't have a country anymore. I do think that the CBC is integral to our sense of each other in this place, especially as we're so online, so digital, so easy to cloister yourself in your own sort of interests. You forget that you're part of something bigger. And if we lose the CBC, we lose the ability to hear from those people, to talk to those people on open line radio, whatever it might be. And I don't think it's going to be like the country disappears tomorrow, but it would be this sort of slow moving national unity crisis where one day we wake up and we're basically just Americans. And I don't want that.
Just sitting with the heft of that sentence, the idea that your son wouldn't have a country anymore, because I connect with that. Like, listen, if I can get my own story into here, I came to this country in the year 2000. I didn't speak English, but my dad had the CBC on in the car all the time. That is how I got to know this place. That's how I got to my sense of what the country is. I'm romantic about the CBC because it is sort of my window into getting to know my sense of the rest of the country. And one of the questions that has animated all of my work, to be honest with you, is not just what do we need to know in common, but the larger question, which is what do we need to know in common in order for us to be a we at all? And I think this place is the best answer that I've been able to come up with, which is partly why I do the work that I do. Jonathan, look, man, they've had...
I should not be batting cleanup with these terrible monsters.
No.
Start with the weak one.
Of course you
should. Now about Max.
Of course you should. Well, listen, I'll frame the question differently to you. Well, I'll frame it the same way, which is to say, I'm giving you the power, pal. You move from Truro, Nova Scotia, and now you're the head of the CBC. And you get to do a thing that's going to turn around people's relationship with the CBC. What do you think that's going to be?
The reason that people on my side of the mic and the camera don't end up in those positions is because it's easy for me as a pundit to say what I would do to fix it. But let's be honest, I'd probably run a live camera on a beaver somewhere and run it into the ground in the first morning. Come on, that was so cool. There is no easy answer. And both of my esteemed colleagues were so articulate and beautiful. I will share one thing from my rearview mirror. I'm wearing an Edmonton sweatshirt. I'm an Edmonton Oilers fan, not because of Wayne Gretzky, but because of Peter Zosky, who, when I was a kid, was my broadcasting idol. My idol, someone who was equally nosy and curious, and who knew that if you were sitting in the back of the canoe as an interviewer, you could just steer it and let the interviewee paddle furiously in the front until they've confessed things they didn't want to share. I believe in the CBC where you stay in the car outside Sobeys, the upscale version or the country version, because you have to hear the end of an interview.
Yeah.
And I too, though I don't have a son, worry about a future where that's not an option for how we self-identify.
That is a deeply beautiful place to leave it. I'm really grateful for all of you for being here for this perspective, and I found it very fortifying, and so I'm really appreciative of your time and your energy. So I just want to say again, Jonathan Torrens, Max Fawcett, and Abba Duncan, you guys are terrific. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See ya.
Max Fawcett is a National Observer's lead columnist. He was in Calgary. Jonathan Torrens is a podcast host, actor, and author in Truro, Nova Scotia. And Abba Duncan is the Carty Chair in Journalism, Diversity, and Inclusion Studies at Carleton University. You have been listening to the second part of our series on the future of the CBC. Can I just encourage you to go back and check out our podcast from Wednesday? That's the one where we had our group chat with 3 fierce critics of the CBC. They all say that the public broadcaster needs to change in a big way if it's going to survive. It's worth listening to both of them. It's worth listening to both of them in conversation with each other. My name is Alamin Abdul Mahmoud. This show is called Commotion. Thank you so much for listening.